Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, Deputy Director of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I want to welcome you to this talk, which is part of our ongoing housing research seminar. At our next session, which will be held in 2 weeks, on 2 weeks from today, we'll release a new report written by researchers from the Center and from AARP, assessing whether older adults have equitable access to livable communities. More information about that event and other upcoming events is available on our webpage, www.jchs.harvard.edu. Today, we're pleased to host Alex Hermann, a senior research analyst here at the center, who will share findings from a forthcoming paper that he is co-authoring with 2 of our Joint Center colleagues, Whitney Airgood-Obricki and Sophia Wedeen. Alex will talk for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then he'll answer questions, which should be posted via Zoom's Q&A feature. We'll wrap things up a little bit after 1 p.m., certainly no later than 1:15 p.m. Given the subject, the time, the number of people watching, I apologize in advance if we don't get to all of your questions. Alex, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. I'm gonna share my screen with you all now, with the hopes that that works out okay. Are you guys able to see everything? I guess let me know if not. Thanks, David, for the introduction. As David mentioned, I'm a researcher here at the Joint Center. I want to start with a few thank yous. First to David for inviting me here to give this talk. I think it's an interesting and important topic, measuring renter affordability, and we'll talk about why I think that in just a few moments. But I also would be remiss not to thank my colleagues and co-authors, Whitney Airgood-Obricki and Sophia Wedeen, both on your screens, without whom this wouldn't have been possible at all whatsoever. So yeah, let's get started first, I think, with a roadmap. Where we're going. I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation and background of the paper, and also spend a decent amount of time talking about the data, sample, and methods that underpin it. This is fundamentally a paper about measuring renter affordability, and how we do that data-wise is important. And then we'll get into the results, who's cost burdened by the residual income method, under what circumstances, and then we'll talk about policy interventions, potential policy interventions that make those burdens less burdensome for folks. Before that, I want to read off a few key takeaways for y'all to give you some of the major highlights. Fully 62% of working age renters in our study had residual income cost burdens in 2018. And that means they lack the income to afford a comfortable standard of living after you account for their housing costs. Residual income burdens are nearly universal for lower income households, but also high for middle income households and for households with children in particular. And we'll talk about what a residual income burden is in a second, how we measure it. These same households also have larger income deficits, meaning they require more income to afford a comfortable standard of living, even when they are burdened. And then subsidies that address the income deficit by targeting housing and transportation costs can put a dent into residual income burdens, but that's primarily for middle income households at the margins. And even some of these measures are relatively small in their effect in some ways. So there's probably some opportunities to think bigger about how we address some of these problems. So with that, I want to move into our motivation and background, and starting with a bit about why do we care about renter affordability? Why do we put housing costs as at the center of our study of affordability? And there are a few reasons for this. One, rent is the single largest expense for most renter households. So most people in the country spend more for a place to live than they do for any other single thing. 2, rent is paid on a fixed monthly schedule with no wiggle. And by that, I mean, once you've locked into a rental contract, right, that's going to be the amount you owe, right? There's no getting out of it in most cases. In the case of most other expenses, you can kind of consume less food, right? You can consume less transportation, you can drive less, you can spend less on these other things. In some cases, that's completely inadvisable, but you can do it, right? But it's hard to consume less housing. Even in the cases where you can move, moving itself can be expensive. In any case, there's a minimum you spend on housing that's quite high under pretty much all circumstances. And then lastly, the consequences of non-payment are potentially very dire, right? So non-payment can hurt your credit. It can also result in emotional distress, and ultimately non-payment can result in eviction. You can be forced to leave your home. So for these reasons, to use a phrase coined by Matthew Desmond in his study in his book Evicted, right? The rent eats first. It's the single largest bill most households have. It has to be paid, and as a result, it's the center of our thinking about affordability. Beyond the kind of conceptual question, right, there's also very practical considerations here, right? Over time, a greater share of US households are spending a large chunk of their income on housing, right? So this figure comes from a report we released in January on rental housing in the US. It shows that in 2001, 40.6% of renters in the country spent more than 30% of their income on housing. By 2011, it had climbed up north of 50%. By 2018, that's come down slightly. It's declined for most of the past 7 years, but still 47.5% of renters spent more than 30% of their income on housing. From that same report, we also know that those who are cost burdened have less money left over to spend on other necessities, right? So lower income renter households with severe burdens, those who spend more than 50% of their income on housing, spent 38% less on food and 40% less on healthcare than similarly situated low income renters without cost burdens. So being renter burdened means having to make substantial trade-offs on your consumption of other goods. And this figure and the basis for this discussion so far has been one measure of affordability. That's the 30% of income standard. This percent of income standard is based on a threshold, in our case, 30%. And that's the most common affordability metric you'll see in our reports here at the Joint Center. It's really become the standard measure for assessing affordability in broader context. So I'll refer to it as the standard or traditional measure throughout this presentation, or the 30% measure. And there's actually good reason for that, right? It's intuitive and pretty easy to calculate. All I need to know is your income and housing costs. And from there, I can pretty easily derive what share of income you spend on housing. That simplicity also makes it somewhat comparable across market contexts and over time. It's also deeply rooted in federal housing policy. So for example, housing choice voucher recipients will still pay up to 30% of their income on housing, and the voucher covers the difference between that 30% and the actual rent owed, right? But this simplicity is also a weakness in some ways, right? Is the 30% of income standard the right approach and right number for both low income and high income households? Is it the right approach in low and high cost markets? It doesn't fundamentally account for different spending needs that vary across income, that vary across market types, that vary across household types, right? So holding income and housing costs equal, right? A single person household is going to have fewer spending needs than a large family with children, right? And that's true for food, for household supplies, true for childcare, and you know, a lot of things, transportation, everything, really, right? And that's where an alternative measure comes in. And it's the measure we use in this paper. It's the residual income cost burden. We'll be talking about this today. The residual income approach is a measure pioneered by another researcher, Michael Stone, whose concept of shelter poverty goes back almost 3 decades. It considers the necessary housing and non-housing expenses that a household has. And these expenses vary with location, they vary with household size, and varies with the composition of the household. And that's how we measure residual burdens, and we'll get to that. How it's measured, the residual is what's left over after subtracting housing costs from your income. Is the residual sufficient to cover all non-housing expenditures? And if it's not, then we consider your residual income burden. And I'll go through an example in just a minute. But weaknesses still remain, right? The measure is imperfect in a number of ways. How do you determine what's essential non-housing costs? How do you measure it? How do you determine what's necessary for specific types of households in specific places? So in a sense, it could be very data intensive, unlike the 30% measure. You also still can't account for all variation in need and personal preference, right? So some households can choose to consume more housing and other kinds of necessities, right? Based on what they want. And spending needs also vary with health status, with means of transportation. It varies with distance from social networks, place of employment, and numerous other factors. We're not going to be able to capture all of that individuality in spending needs. So a couple research questions that don't cover the entire paper, but will cover the focus of the talk here today. So using the residual income burdens approach, how many households in the US have enough income to support a comfortable standard of living after accounting for their housing costs? How does affordability vary by household type? How does it vary by income, geography, and other circumstances? And how does this compare to the 30% of income standard? What does it reveal about measuring affordability that the 30% of income standard doesn't? And then what, if any, policy interventions improve affordability, and what interventions improve affordability the most? These are all questions we'll kind of get into in just a moment. But for now, excuse me, there's a bug in front of me. Now, one thing I said a moment ago, right, is that the residual income approach is data intensive. So what data are we going to use to calculate it? We use two primary data sources. The first is the Economic Policy Institute's Family Budget Calculator, and the second is the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey, and we use the 2018 version of that. We'll dive into both of these now. The first is an overview of the EPI Family Budget Calculator, and this estimates household expenditures for every household, for every county in the US, right? And these expenditure estimates vary by circumstance with the number of households, right? So they provide estimates for every county for 1 to 2 adult households with 0 to 4 children. So the range of possible household types are single adult households just with 1 person to 2 adult households with up to 4 kids, right? And everything in between that. The EPI also is meant to capture income of the income a family needs in order to attain a modest yet comfortable or modest yet adequate standard of living. So these estimates are not about survival. They're not about identifying the minimum needed to function in the world, but it estimates instead what it would cost to attain a modest but adequate living standard. Okay, so EPI provides expenditure estimates for 7 different spending categories. We use 6 of those categories. You see here it's the top 6: transportation, healthcare, food, childcare, taxes, and other necessities. Each of these estimates are derived from their own source, and we make adjustments to 4 of them. I'll touch briefly on them here. I don't have enough time to really go in depth on all of them, but transportation costs are meant to capture the costs associated with car ownership, with use, and with maintenance, plus travel to and from work and for non-social trips, at least for the first adult, right? And non-social trips are driving to the store, driving to the bank, running other kinds of errands. Healthcare costs are meant to capture both your healthcare premiums, which are set at the price of the lowest cost bronze plan for a 40-year-old non-smoker, and your out-of-pocket spending, your copays, your deductibles, on average for 18 to 64-year-olds that vary by region, vary by census region. We don't adjust those first 2 categories, but we make adjustments to the remaining 4 because we have more information about the composition, the income, and ages of the households in our sample that we'll get to in just a moment. For food, we take it from the USDA's low-cost food plan, and we make adjustments for the ages of the household members. And then for child care, we assume full-time intensive care for children under age 6. For children age 6 to 11, we assume after school and summertime care. And then for 12-year-olds, we assume a requirement for summertime care only. For children ages 13 to 17, we assume no additional care is required. And then for taxes, we use the MBER's TaxSim platform to calculate taxes. And this is a microsimulation model of taxation for both federal and state income taxes. We have make a whole set of assumptions for those, and we can come back to all that if we'd like during the Q&A. And then lastly are these other necessities. So miscellaneous expenditures that include clothing, school supplies, reading materials, household cleaning supplies, and other kind of necessary items. So EPI finds that low-income households spend about 40% of their food and housing costs on other needs, so all those other needs. So we recalculate using that ratio given our updated expenditures. So that's a lot. We can come back to that if we need to. But I'm going to move on now to the other primary data source. This is the American Community Survey, which is a large annual survey of the U.S. economic, demographic, and social conditions. This is important, from the 2018 ACES, we observe actual U.S. renter households, right, and some of their characteristics. So for real households, we have the number of persons in the household, we have their ages, we have their household income, and we have how much they spend on rent and utilities. And one note on income, this is gross pre-tax income from a variety of sources, mostly wage and salary for most renter households, but also includes interest and rental income, dividend income, and then some cash-based public assistance like TANF and Social Security Disability. So to measure residual income burdens, we combine these two data sources, right? So using these two data sources, we map the assumed EPI expenditures for transportation, healthcare, et cetera, onto actual households sampled in the ACS. When rent is subtracted from household income, we ask, do households have enough left over, that's the residual, to pay for all non-housing expenses? If no, that household is residual income burden. If they do have enough to cover all those other expenses, then we say the household is unburdened. And if that's still confusing, we're going to walk through a quick example here, right? So this is an actual household sampled in the ACS. This is a single parent household living in Macomb County, Michigan, happens to be where I'm from. And it has two children. Both of them are teenagers, age 13 to 17. The parent is 36 years old, and their household income is $41,000. And we also know their gross rent, which is $760 per month. Seems crazy living in Boston, but that is true for a number of people in Macomb County. And that annualizes out to about $9,000 annually. So using information on the location and composition of the household, plus the ages, the household members, we can estimate their non-housing expenditures. This is the annual expenditures from the EPI data, right? So we pull in this EPI data. You can see transportation costs, 12 grand, miscellaneous expenditures are 8 grand. Childcare is 0 because these are two teenagers, recall. Actually getting some money back on their taxes based on their income and the number of children they have. That's based on a simulation model. So their total non-housing expenses are a little over 33 grand, 33,500 bucks. And how we actually calculate then, right, is we have that household income, 41 grand. We have your housing expenses. What's the residual, right? Once I subtract the expenses, it's about 32 grand, 31,880 bucks. Now, when I account for your non-housing expenses, the remaining 33 grand 500 we just looked at on the last page, do you have enough left over to be able to afford that comfortable standard of living? In this case, no. So we'd say there's an income deficit of about $1,600 for this particular household. I'm going to do another quick calculation, or walk through another quick calculation. What about the 30% of income standard? How would I get at those costs? I only need 2 items in this case, right? Both of them provided in the American Community Survey. That same household, again, has just about $9,000 in housing expenses and $41,000 in income. They spend about 22% of their income on rent. So they would not be cost burdened by the traditional measure of cost burdens, but they are cost burdened by the residual income once you account for all their other non-housing expenditures. And we do this for every household in our sample, right? And our sample, I guess to be clear here, right, is working age renter households in the US with 1 to 2 adults, ages 18 to 64, that's what working age is in our sample, and 0 to 4 children. We do this because it comports with the EPI estimates. We exclude older adults age 65 and over for similar reasons, but also because their expenses differ in ways, systematically in ways that we can't quite capture. It would be a different project to try and estimate expenditures for that group. After exclusions, we capture 71% of the nation's renter households, so about 31 million in total. Of the remaining 29%, 18% have an older adult living in the home, 11% have 3 or more adults, and 1% have exclusions for other reasons, mostly the existence of 5 or more children in the home. Yeah, so let's get on to the good stuff, right? Let's talk about some of our results. And we're going to start with the average annual estimated expenses for these households in our sample. On average, renter households in our sample spend more on housing than they do on any other individual item. Rent on average is about $13,600 for these households, or about 24% of all expected spending on average. The second largest expenditure is transportation, the one up top. That's at $11,400, and that's followed by healthcare, food, miscellaneous costs, taxes, and then childcare. Of course, childcare costs are much higher for households with children, but zero for households without children, right? So that's the expenditure that varies most on these households. And to kind of like, what's our first impression of these expenses, or at least what's my first impression of these expenses, right? Is they're high overall. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind about that. One, this is the mean expense, right? The median for these is a bit lower for all of these categories, not substantially, but a bit. There's also substantial variation across the country, and we'll come back to that in just a second. But second, and probably more important, is worth keeping in mind that what we're measuring, kind of going back to what we're measuring, is how much is needed for households to obtain a basic but adequate standard of living. So of course, households can and do survive on much less, right? But if we were instead measuring for some absolute minimum needed to like get by or to survive, our estimates on spending would be lower. These expenses also vary by household type, as I mentioned. Average non-housing expenses are $29,000 for single-person households. And then they range up to $66,000 for two adult households with kids. So that variation by household type that we want to capture with the residual income burden method, right? We're actually capturing, and it's working on some level. I said that expenses also vary a bit geographically, and they do, but even then there's still a substantial floor. So for example, non-housing expenses for a single person household in the lowest cost counties is still about $18,000. That's even before you account for rent. So there's no getting away from this comfortable standard of living that we're shooting for, right? And in really any part of the country. So when we take these individual costs and run our residual income burden calculations for renters in our sample, we find that about 19.2 million of our 30 million renter households have residual income burdens. That's about 3/5 of renter households. And that's much higher than the 15 million renters in our same sample with standard cost burdens. As you can see, there's considerable overlap between the two measures. About 94% of renters with standard burdens also have residual income burdens. And then an additional 5.3 million renters without standard burdens were residual income cost burden. That's the example we looked at earlier is an example of that. It's pretty typical, as you can see. Lastly, about 942,000 households are cost burdened by the 30% measure, but aren't cost burdened by the residual income approach. And the vast majority of these households are 1 to 2 adult households without kids. So we suspect in a lot of cases these are people who are able to make that trade-off, consume a little more housing, spend a little more on housing without affecting the lower cost of everything else that they need to live on and get by. So in total then, 62% of working age renter households are cost burdened by the residual income approach in our study. That's the far right bar, this kind of yellow bar on the far right here. And that's about 14 percentage points higher than the standard burden measure, right? The 30% of income measure represented by the blue bar. However, there's a great deal of variation here, right? In the burden rate by household type. So single parent households have the highest burden rates at about 88%, followed by 2 adult households with children at 74%. By contrast, 60% of single person households and 43% of 2 adult households without children have burdens. Burdens are not only highest for households with children, the gap between the residual burden and the standard burden rate is also widest for these households, right? So for single parent household, residual burdens are about 18 percentage points higher. And then for 2 adult households with children, the gap in the burden is about 32 percentage points. So that gets at what the traditional standard measure of measuring cost burdens doesn't get at, right, is all the non-housing expenses that households of this type are the expenses that they actually have and aren't being accounted for in that traditional burden measure. Residual burdens also vary by income, right? So residual burdens are nearly universal for lower income households with under $30,000 in household income. So consider those average costs we looked at previously, right? If non-housing expenses average over 40 grand to obtain a basic but comfortable standard of living, then most households in this income range are not going to have sufficient incomes to cover both their housing and non-housing spending needs. But burdens are also extremely high for this group when using the 30% standard, right? 86% of renters in our sample earning under 15,000 had standard cost burdens, as did 82% earning between 15 and 30,000. So these differences are large, but burdens using the 30% measure were already very high. The gap in the two burden rates is actually widest for middle income households. So 81% of renters earning between $30,000 and $45,000 had residual income burdens. That's about 28 percentage points higher than the share with standard burdens. And then the residual burden rate is 39% for renters in that next income bracket, the $45,000 to $75,000. And that's 14 percentage points higher than the standard burden rate. Another way to kind of consider this analysis is by looking at the income deficits for households who have residual burdens, right? So if you look at that top bar there, what this says is that on average, low-income renters with under $15,000 in household income who have residual burdens need about $35,000 of additional income to be able to afford a comfortable standard of living. The income deficit is highest for these lower income households, and again, unsurprisingly, households with children, but maybe it is a little more surprising that the average deficit is actually pretty between the two groups. For all renter households, right, that bottom gray bar, for all renter households with residual burdens, there's an average income deficit about $24,500. So I'm going to conclude this by talking a bit about potential policy interventions. There are a handful of simulations we run in the paper that consider almost all the spending categories as areas of possible intervention, but I want to spotlight two that I think are most relevant for this group and for us as housing researchers, I suppose, too. The first is a housing subsidy that's modeled essentially after existing federal housing policy. For households who spend more than 30% of their income on housing, what would happen to the residual income burdens if we set those costs to exactly 30%? In essence, we're providing a subsidy that sets housing costs equal to 30% for traditionally burdened households and make no other changes. In the second simulated policy intervention, we provide a similar subsidy that sets both housing and transportation costs equal to 45%. And that's a different measure of affordability that we don't use so much at the Joint Center, but that Center for Neighborhood Technology that calculated transportation costs, that's what they use for affordability, given the direct trade-offs people make between housing and transportation. So why housing and transportation? As we looked at previously, housing is the largest expense for households on average, and transportation is the second largest. So housing is about a quarter of total spending in our sample on average, while combined housing and transportation are about 44% of spending for households in our sample. The other reason we focus on these interventions is they show the most promise of the interventions we modeled. So this figure shows what the actual residual income cost burden rate is. That's the blue bar, and what it would be under the two policy interventions we just discussed, right? So differences here really are only modest, right? Especially overall, if you look at the right. So the overall burden rate ticks down from about 62%, and that's in our actual, right, residual burden total, to 60% if you have just a housing subsidy. It goes down a little further to 54% with the housing and transportation subsidy. In that last case, that would mean there would be 2.4 million fewer renters with residual income burdens. Residual burdens remain almost universally high for the lowest income households. They're still over 90% for renters with incomes between $15,000 and $30,000, even with the housing and transportation subsidy. But the largest improvements are among middle income households, right? Those that were already most likely to be at the margins. So for renters earning 30 to 45,000, their burden rate would move down from about 81% to about 51% if you factor in both housing and transportation subsidies. And it's probably worth stating, even though it might be obvious that such an intervention, of course, wouldn't just benefit moderate income renters, right? The housing subsidy that we present here alone would reduce housing costs for all renter households by about 20%. And these subsidies would also reduce the income deficit for these households substantially. And that's especially true for low income households who are most likely to spend more than 30% of their income on housing. So renters with residual incomes have an income deficit of nearly $25,000 on average. There's $24,500 we discussed, right? So this is what would happen for those with residual income burdens, what would happen to their income deficit on average under these two simulated policy interventions, right? So renters with residual income burdens on average have a deficit of $25,000. Under the affordable housing policy scenario, their average deficit drops about 17% to $20,000. With a housing and transportation subsidy combined, the deficit declines 39% to $15,000 on average. And these effects are even larger for low income households. So for the lowest income households, the average deficit drops 22%, and then 50% under the two policy simulations. I want to wrap up by noting these interventions would help in other ways as well, right? So there are other benefits to having affordable, quality, stable housing beyond what we're measuring here. But it would also require much more than that to allow renter households in the country to obtain even a modest but adequate standard of living. I think ensuring everyone has access to a comfortable standard of living is a policy goal worth pursuing. And housing assistance is one of the important mechanisms by which you can start to make inroads there. But given the deficit households face by itself, it's probably not enough to reach that if it is your goal. So there's also room to think bigger. We discuss here combining reductions in housing costs with other household needs like transportation that are deeply intertwined with housing, but it's also worth considering other things, right? There's bigger picture solutions, universal basic income, wage subsidies, higher wage floors. Those are all largely beyond my purview as a housing researcher, but there's a lot of opportunity to think about how those big ideas relate to housing. And with that, I'm gonna say thank you. There's a ton we can touch on that we didn't get to here that will show up in the paper. So I hope that's, if that's of interest to you, that includes kind of trying to disentangle some of the household and market level factors most associated with residual income burdens through some modeling work. There's also a geographic level story I didn't really get to here. We could talk a lot more about expenditures. So I'm happy to answer whatever questions y'all have.
Thank you, Alex. Really Fascinating. Encouraging folks to use the Q&A function, which I will try, and I'll be sort of curating and combining. In answer, we will, by the way, be posting Alex's slides on our website as we usually do after events, and a video of this event will also be available. Alex, there were a couple questions just on some definitions.
Yeah.
And I'm going to bundle them together. Does the measure of housing costs include utilities? And a couple people wanted to know, when you look at income, is that gross income or after tax income? And also what might get covered in miscellaneous?
Great. So let's go back, I guess, to the expenditures. On the rent side, yes. We're counting both the rent you pay, the contract rent you pay to your landlord, but also your utilities. That is fuel costs, electricity, water. And that's true both in the residual burden method and the 30% of income standard. On the income side, we're looking at both. We're looking at gross pre-tax income from a variety of sources. That includes kind of your wage and salary income, of course, but also any dividend income, any rental income you receive, any interest income, some public benefits, but not all. When we model taxes, we're putting in some of the expected. So in a way, we're looking at pre-tax income, and then we're counting your income taxes as an expense with this MBER micro simulation model. In the actual income we observe in the ACS, that doesn't include income that gets distributed through the tax code, so things like the earned income tax credit, but it is modeled on the cost section, right? So if you saw our example household had a negative tax, and that was both probably a result of deductions that she had as a result of having 2 children and 2 dependents, but also potentially something from EITC or some other benefit. So we're capturing a wide source of income here. And I think there was a third part of that
question. There was one about sort of what got covered in miscellaneous.
Thank you. Yeah. So miscellaneous costs include things like textbooks, cleaning supplies, clothing, laundry detergent. There's a fuller accounting in our paper and in the EPI estimates, but it's not a super liberal usage of the term miscellaneous. And like I said previously, the EPI, I think I said this at least, in their measurement of these additional necessary expenditures, they identified that lower income households spend about 40% of their food and housing costs on those measures, and we took that measure and brought it over for the use of our paper as well.
Thanks. There are a couple questions about trying to think about how to translate this into policy. One is just saying well, actually there are 3. One is what would the implication, how much, if you were to actually provide the sort of subsidies you were talking about, how much money are we talking about? How big a program? One was on feasibility, which is this a measure, unlike the 30% measure, that could be easily translated into at least thinking about program eligibility? And then the third was, is there any reason to think that if you provided this level of subsidies, that landlords might not respond by raising rents and capturing the subsidy and leaving people as bad off as they were?
Yeah, so I'll try to address those questions to the best of my ability. One, yeah, I mean, certainly would be expensive to provide a housing subsidy to all renter households that are spending more than 30% of their income on housing, right? I think there's a reason why the existing housing subsidies we have are targeted towards extremely low income and low income households, and we don't even universally fund those low income households who are eligible for subsidies, right? So I think you could start there if cost is your major concern. Start with the lowest, the lowest income folks that need, and I see that Whitney might even be on this call. I forget exactly what we do have a number, like an aggregate number that these simulations could potentially cost, right? It's a rough figure. I don't know it off the top of my head, but it is in the paper. And I also think it's worth calling attention to the fact that these are different measures, right? This 30% of income standard is not meant to capture all the nuance, right? That's allowed. That's kind of what makes it so effective and so intuitive. The one thing that we do like about the residual income approach that we're using, the way we present it, is it provides a number of possible mechanisms, right? If housing isn't quite your flavor, there's in the paper we model what's essentially would be a healthcare subsidy. We model what essentially would be additional SNAP or food stamp benefits. We model essentially what would be a free universal child care program. Excuse me. So there are multiple points of intervention that you can kind of use to address this overriding affordability concern. I don't know if that gets at all of the question, but if there's anything left floating, I'd be happy to pick it back. Okay.
It does raise actually a very simple question, which is a couple of people have asked, when do you think the paper will be available?
So we're in the middle of what we think and hope are final revisions. And at that point, it's just a matter of how long it takes to wrap up. So I'd expect end of this year, early next year.
Okay.
Seems pretty reasonable. So soon.
And we at the Joint Center will, using our blog and our website, push that out. So if you're not signed up for our blog and news, you should do so. So you'll get to see you'll get to see the paper. There are a couple questions that are just curious about some of the geographic variations, particularly whether there are either regional variations, but also is there anything you can say about city versus suburban versus rural locations?
So I have not looked at that, and I don't think we've looked at that, the city suburban outlook. We've mostly focused on what's happening in different types of markets. One thing that is a bit intriguing is the distribution in income matters a lot more than your housing costs in this model than it does in the traditional 30% of income measure. So higher cost in higher income places perform a lot better on this measure. So I think there are only 2 large metro areas with a residual burden rate below 50% in the country. And if I remember correctly, they are San Jose and I believe Los Angeles. I could be wrong. And maybe it's not Los Angeles, but it's another like very high income place, right? And that's almost counterintuitive, right? You'd expect housing costs, the very high housing costs for renters in a place like San Jose to kind of wash out any gains in affordability you'd have from having slightly higher incomes. But the reality is that most renters in San Jose are higher income. The issue is when you're in San Jose, what do you do? And this is a complicated figure that I won't try and walk through, is what do you do if you're a lower income or a moderate or lower income renter? If you're a lower income renter in our sample anywhere, you're almost 100% likely to be cost burden, right? Over 90% of our sample is cost burden if they earn under 30% of if they earn under $30,000 a year. But if you're a middle income renter in San Jose, if you earn between $30,000 to $45,000, or you earn between $45,000 to $75,000, then you're much more likely to be burdened than you are anywhere else. So it tells a slightly different story about geography than the traditional cost burden ones. It's something we get into the paper a little bit. Probably something as part of our revisions we'll get into a little bit more. And then that city suburban, because we have county level estimates, it's something we actually could look at with some level of precision, imperfect levels of precision, but something we could kind of look into, but I haven't done that yet. It's a great question.
A couple folks have wondered, how do you think about, how is it possible that somebody faces a $25,000 deficit? What do we think that data means in real life?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and by our sample, that's not just likely, it's pretty common, right? That's the average deficit, a burden, and that's not all renters, right? That's what a burden, a residual income burden renter is facing, and what that means in real life is that households, in order to obtain that comfortable standard of living, are trading off in important ways, right? So they're spending less on childcare, or they're forced to use some kind of family care. It means they're spending less on other things. Maybe they're not, maybe they're cutting back at the grocery store in ways they shouldn't. And that's especially true for very low income renters whose average deficits are closer to 35 grand, right? As I said to kind of open this talk, you can't really, there's no wiggle room on your rent for the most part, right? But there is wiggle room for everything else, and that has really bad negative outcomes for people. If you're low income and afraid to go to the doctors, or you're low income and afraid to spend too much money on food, that can have some serious consequences. And we think housing is a big part of that, and it kind of goes back to. So we think it illustrates some of the trade-offs that households are forced to make in a pretty unique way.
Couple of people have been very struck, as was I will confess, by the, well, actually by two things. And I'll actually ask it as two separate questions. The first is the very large gap for single parent households and also dual parent households, and wondering if that doesn't suggest that a policy focused on helping people with childcare might make sense. And I guess part of that question is, I'm not sure if that's something that you modeled, or if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, and it's something we did model, and it is striking, right? So this slide to me is very striking, that the average income deficit for renters with burdens is pretty similar between households with children and households earning under $15,000. And one, that speaks to the extraordinary costs of childcare in the US, right? And we absolutely could and should do more to support children and support families. And to me, that's hard to refute, because we do very little as it is. But it speaks to also the kinds of things that households are forced to do to manage childcare, and that can, you know, that can mean any number of things. We did simulate what it would mean. I believe it was a full childcare allowance, right? If you set childcare costs to zero through a subsidy, and a lot of households do manage that somehow, right? They're you know, families, you know, support networks are close to zero, at least functionally zero. It doesn't move the needle as much as you'd think. It's actually it matters very little for these households. Another thing, that these households have a lot of other costs associated with children that aren't just childcare related, right? So if you look at the expenses for single parent and two adult children's, or two adult households with children, their expenses around transportation, healthcare, food, especially, right? Miscellaneous costs, everything is expensive if you have kids. It's not just childcare. So I do think there's plenty of opportunity here to think about targeted interventions towards families and households with children. I think would absolutely be appropriate for sure.
And the other question folks had, there have been a couple of different questions about, somewhat surprised by the difference you found, the difference the two methods produced for moderate and higher income renter households, and which in a way cuts against the kind of conventional wisdom that the 30% standard might overestimate those rent burdens, basically people buying much nicer housing. So why do you think that the residual method is actually producing such a distinctive gaps at those income levels?
That's a great question. In a previous paper that I had written with Chris Herbert and Dan McHugh, two other colleagues at the Joint Center, we used a different residual income approach, using more of a needs-based model, the self-sufficiency standard at the University of Washington. And that's exactly what we found, is that housing cost burdens by income were likely understated for lower income households, and were somewhat overstated for middle and higher income households. And I think I think that speaks to one, the standard, the standard we're applying to this paper, right? Which is not about need. It's not about the minimum amount you need to just get by, or or something like that, right? But it's about having this modest standard of living, about having this comfortable standard of living, and that gets more expensive for more middle income households. Aren't single person households, right? The income is correlated by the number of people in the household. So I think there's some other effects here that we can and should disaggregate in the paper, but that's a good comment for sure.
One I think we're probably the last question, maybe one after this. One of the really striking things that has come in the Joint Center's rental reports and the State of the Nation's housing reports is not only the share of renters that are cost burdened, but the fact that something like half of them are extremely cost burdened, paying more than 50% of their income. I don't know if you looked at a similar kind of metric for using the residual income approach? Does it, would the residual income results sort of track that here?
So you could do something like that, right? And we have looked at this. So, you know, there are households who have nothing left over after you account for their rent, right? Like it almost seems impossible to think of how can you have higher housing costs than you have income, right? But think about the same kinds of trade-offs folks have, right? Maybe you are in a new rental situation, your income has changed over time. Maybe you're forced to use non-income or income sources you don't report, or sources that aren't income, to cover your housing costs. So you could look at what is essentially like a severe residual burden. Who are the households who don't have any income after accounting for the housing, or have such a small amount of income they really have nothing left over to spend it. And it's a relatively small part of our sample. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it's like 6-ish%, maybe 8-9% of renter households. So not nothing, but it is a small share, and it is something you could we could look at. It's not something we've done too much work on, though.
Okay, well, I think we've covered most of the ground that came up in questions, but we will take a look at these. We do save those, and if there's something, it'll get addressed in the paper. I have been informed that I overpromised. We actually can't post the slides yet because they haven't been finalized in terms of the paper. The video will be posted, so you could always harvest. But you're gonna, if you want copies of the final version, do wait for the paper. This is really important work, and I know this is a line of research that the center has dipped into periodically, as I think you've discussed. It produces some very important insights. It's a little bit hard still to think about how to operationalize it, and I think it reminds us that while the rent does eat first, everybody is at the table, and as we think about solving housing problems, what we're trying to think about is making sure people not only have access to decent and affordable housing, but that's done in a way that they also have access to the other things in their lives that they need to have a decent and high quality living situation. And this is just really important, I think, to keep to keep focusing on, particularly given how intractable the affordability issue seems to have been over the last decade, even as it was pre-COVID, the economic recovery continued. Actually, let me ask you one last question, which I had meant and just reminded myself. Is there anything that you've seen coming out of the preliminary data on the impact of COVID and the COVID-related recession that makes you wonder or worry or sheds light on some of what you've been finding in this? How does this data change any of your thinking about the impacts of COVID?
That's a big question, but I think an important one, and probably
we're out of time.
well, probably something I should have addressed even, right?
Yeah.
And it's worth maybe mentioning here, we're working as a center right now on the State of the Nation's Housing Report for 2020, which comes out in November. It typically comes out in June, and it got pushed back because of COVID, and because we've been trying to get our heads around what's happening. In terms of, you know, it's hard to say what it means exactly for our measurements of affordability here when we don't have any good data that we could use to replicate this kind of analysis post-COVID. That would be impossible. But the thing that strikes me is that COVID's really brought to light how important some of these, you know, not just housing certainly, right? How important housing is, how important affordable housing is, how important like it is to have a safe space, a place to live and to exist, and you know, so if anything, the whole pandemic we're living through now makes those things more important. I'd encourage people to look out. I believe the release date is November 19th.
believe that's right.
hopefully sometime in mid to late November, where we'll be able to dive into that and talk about some of those implications a lot.
I mean, I think our previous blogs have said the impacts have been particularly harsh on renters, on lower income households, and obviously on, at least anecdotally, we know on people with children, all issues that get highlighted.
Absolutely. Yeah.
As Alex said, the State of the Nation's housing report is scheduled to be released on November 19th. Stay tuned for the exact details. Alex, I want to thank you, and particularly for presenting work that is still being finalized, but is so far is I think far enough along that I hope this was helpful for you. It certainly has been helpful and insightful for us. I want to thank everybody for spending some time with us, and look forward to having you join us again in 2 weeks when we release the report on livability and older Americans. Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone.